Hey, just a quick reminder that I have a coffee, so if you enjoyed today's video and would like to support what I do, then feel free to donate or check out the membership tiers. Anyways, on to the video.
Similarly, I also have a Patreon page. If you would like to support this channel and support the content that I create, link is in the description.
Heyo everyone, Misha Barkin here. I'm sure it goes without saying, but COVID's had a pretty big impact on the world as a whole.
Yes, and a lot of that impact hasn't come from COVID itself. Keep in mind that COVID has a very high survivability rate and most young healthy people don't experience symptoms. An overwhelming majority of the impact that COVID has had on our society has largely come from the media blowing it out of proportion, as well as the government implementing ridiculous policies like lockdowns and mask mandates, which have had basically no effect on the spread of COVID.
And this includes our community.
A lot of the impact that COVID has had on the furry community hasn't really come from the virus itself. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but the people who are primarily affected by COVID are over 60, and most people in the furry fandom are in the 20 to 30 age range. Now, of course, there are some so-called gray muzzles. That's a word used to describe older people in the furry fandom, but for most of the fandom, COVID doesn't pose a significant risk. A lot of the impact that COVID has had on the furry fandom has come from within the fandom. People on social media bashing people who don't want to wear a mask or take the vaccine. For reasons that are beyond the scope of this video, the furry fandom has become very politically polarized as of recently. And although this has been happening before the pandemic definitely exacerbated the issue.
It's been a wild ride so far, and unfortunately with the Delta variant on the rise,
One very common strategy often used by COVID doomers is fear-mongering about variants. Keep in mind that all a variant is just a change in the genetic code of the virus. Now yes, of course it could make the virus more potent, but more often than not it actually has the opposite effect. Subsequent mutations usually make the virus less deadly because natural selection favors less deadly viruses. If a virus kills its host, then it can't reproduce as much. And we're seeing that now with the most recent variant, the Omicron variant. The Omicron is the least deadly variant to date. There's yet to be a single confirmed death because of Omicron.
and anti-vax people spouting their rhetoric.
So you're going to have to specify what specifically you mean by anti-vax, because there are several different groups of people that term could possibly be referring to. It could be referring to people who are against vaccines altogether, it could be referring to people who are specifically against the COVID vaccine, or it could be referring to people who may not necessarily be against taking vaccines, but are against them being mandatory. You see, there's a reason that liberals in the media like to throw around the term anti-vax. Because the term is vague enough to include several different ideologies, it's a convenient way not just for them to attack several different viewpoints at once, but also run for cover against counter-arguments. Because when you put forth a rebuttal, they can easily counter it by saying, I wasn't referring to those anti-vaxxers, I was referring to these anti-vaxxers.
It doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon.
Maybe for you it seems that way, but from what I've noticed, life is basically back to normal. As of the recording of this video, pretty much every state has lifted their mask mandate. People are starting to congregate in bars and restaurants again, except for in a handful of liberal-controlled cities, which are still implementing mask mandates and vaccine passport systems. An overwhelming majority of the country looks exactly the way it did in 2019. If you're pissed off about the COVID pandemic being dragged on indefinitely, which I don't blame you, then get mad at these liberal politicians for continuing their pandemic power grab, even when the risk of COVID is at an all-time low.
And that being said, a lot of the world is soldiering on as if COVID's over.
Well, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it basically is. Most of the country is vaccinated, deaths and hospitalizations due to COVID are significantly down, the current most prominent variant is least likely of all of them to cause symptoms or pose any significant risk, and there's a wide array of different treatments being developed for people who catch COVID in spite of being vaccinated. So even for that small minority of people who fall through the cracks of the vaccine, there's still protections for them. At this point, I think it would be safe to consider the pandemic over, which, I mean, we're going to have to do at some point. You see, a lot of people on the left have this idea in their head that there will at one point come a day when COVID will cease to exist. And, well, that's not happening. An illness as contagious as COVID simply isn't going to just go away. Now, what will happen, and what seems to be happening right now with the Omicron variant, is that it will go from being pandemic to endemic. What that basically means is that it'll go from being this super deadly virus that's spreading around uncontrollably to just another background illness that people will have to occasionally deal with, like shingles or the flu. The bottom line, though, is that COVID COVID's not going away, and we're going to have to learn to live with it just like we've learned to live with every other illness.
Major meetups and big events are starting to occur once more, and this, once again, includes us in the form of furry conventions. The million-dollar question on the table right now is about those conventions, and whether or not they should be happening. Is there a safe way to have these meetups and cons?
This is actually a question that can be answered very easily by taking a look at Sweden. Sweden never had lockdowns, never even had mask requirements. And in spite of this, they'd have some of the lowest deaths and hospitalizations, not just in Europe, but in the world. And this phenomenon isn't unique to Sweden. There's tons of examples you can look at, like Japan, South Carolina, places that in spite of never having a lockdown experienced very low COVID deaths. This is because in these places, since COVID was more free to spread around, there were more people developing natural immunity, which means that these places were able to get to herd immunity quicker even before the vaccine was developed. If you're a young, healthy person with a strong immune system, then you actually want to catch COVID as quickly as possible, because that means you'll develop natural immunity quicker. I think that this data from Sweden makes a very strong case for not closing furry conventions, especially so when you consider the fact that young, healthy people with strong immune systems make up a majority of the furry fandom.
Should we consider canceling for another year once again and waiting? Is that even a possibility at this point?
Canceling isn't really going to be an option for most conventions. As someone who's been involved with nerd culture for the past decade, and as someone who's actually volunteered on staff at various conventions before, I actually have a somewhat decent understanding of how conventions work. The convention itself is set up and operated by a sponsoring organization, usually a 501c3 nonprofit or similar type organization. Now, in order for this convention to operate, they need to have a venue that's willing to host them. Usually a hotel or a convention center or a banquet hall, some type of physical space for the convention to actually take place at. So the way this works is that the convention organization makes an arrangement with the hosting venue. The convention will agree to pay the hosting venue a certain amount, and part of that payment is made up front before the convention to reserve the space, and the rest of it is paid after the fact from the ticket revenue. Now, what's important to keep in mind here is that the convention is contractually obligated to pay the hosting venue the full agreed upon amount once the convention is over, regardless of what the ticket sales are. So if the total ticket revenue after the convention is over is less than what the convention owes the hosting venue, then the convention is on the hook for whatever that difference is. This has caused plenty of small startup conventions to go belly up in the past. So, if a convention cancels, then unless there's something in the contract that stipulates otherwise, what that basically means is that that convention is going to be on the hook for the entire amount that they owe to the hosting venue. Because if you're canceling, then obviously your ticket revenue is going to be zero. Anthrocon was able to cancel for 2 years consecutively, but only because they're a massive convention with a massive budget. Of course, they can afford to swallow those costs. For smaller conventions, that's definitely not going to be an option.
I'd like to take today to look at both sides of this argument.
So he says that he's going to be looking at both sides of the argument, which in all fairness he does do to an extent, but as you'll see later in the video, there are certain issues where he very clearly puts a lot of emphasis on one side of the argument that doesn't really address the other.
And compare them, then deliver my own conclusion, and I hope you'll make yours based on prior knowledge and what's been presented today.
So before Misha delivers his opinion, I suppose I'll take a moment to clarify what mine is. The way I see it, this is a simple matter of cost-benefit analysis. How do the costs of canceling conventions stack up against the benefits? Given that the primary demographic of the furry fandom, 20 to 30 age range, isn't primarily at risk for COVID, compared against the massive financial costs that conventions can face if they cancel, it just seems like the benefit isn't really worth the risk.
One thing before we dive in, this is something that a lot of people can and will disagree on. Please respect each other's opinions. There's people being absolutely toxic towards those on Twitter. Well, let's be honest, where else?
Yeah, Twitter is pretty toxic. There's a reason I tend to avoid it as much as possible.
People on Twitter are being horrendous towards those who dare have a different opinion on the matter. Now, I'm not talking about anti-vaxxers or anyone dumb enough to inject themselves with horse dewormer.
I won't go into this too much here since it's not the main focus of the video, but Ivermectin has been confirmed to have antiviral properties. I'll link some sources in the description.
I'm talking about those who think we should have cons and those who think we shouldn't. This is a complex subject and has many factors to consider, and just shitting on the opposing side and calling them dumb or careless, or telling those concerned that they're stuck living in fear gets us nowhere. If you'd like to discuss disagreements, do so respectfully.
Bud Light presents Real American Heroes.
Real American heroes.
I have to say, I do really appreciate how this guy wants to be respectful of people with opposing viewpoints. It really is a breath of fresh air, especially coming from a furry, because I can tell you firsthand from experience, civilized discourse among opposing viewpoints is a very rare thing in the furry fandom. It's very common for furries to scream and bitch and whine when they hear opinions they don't like. Trust me, I've been through it before. So even though we most likely aren't going to see eye to eye on this issue, I can at the very least appreciate him for wanting to have a civilized discussion about it, and I'll do my best to try and return the favor.
Now it's time to discuss everyone's absolute favorite topic they're not sick of hearing yet, COVID. COVID is not great right now.
The COVID situation right now is probably the best it's been the entire pandemic. It's way different than it was in the beginning of the pandemic when the virus was just rampaging everywhere and there's nothing we could do about it. Now we have vaccines, treatments, more accurate tests, hospitalizations are down, deaths are down. I mean, yeah, some places are still getting slammed with cases, but for the most part, the pandemic is being handled pretty well.
As of the writing of this script on August 29th, we have almost 85,000 new cases and a 7-day average of 156,000 cases, which is definitely not good. Following the shape of the chart, you can see that we're currently in another major increase in cases right now that, if left unchecked, could easily rival or surpass the first spike we had.
I've discussed this ad nauseum in previous videos, but cases actually aren't the best metric to look at when evaluating the severity of the pandemic. A case simply indicates a positive test. It doesn't tell you whether or not the person is experiencing symptoms. The metrics you really want to look at are deaths and hospitalizations. Specifically, you want to look at confirmed deaths and hospitalizations, because oftentimes a person who's dead or hospitalized can test positive for COVID, even if the reason they died or ended up in the hospital had nothing to do with COVID.
We're in a really pivotal spot right now, and considering the US's track record, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if the spike continues into another lockdown.
There's a surprisingly high number of people calling for another lockdown because of the Omicron variant, and it just goes to show how these people never learn. Lockdowns have never worked. Every single time they've been implemented, they've never worked. You'll have places like California experience a spike in COVID cases, then panic, implement a lockdown, only for that spike to continue during the lockdown. Lockdowns have never worked. There's no evidence that they've done anything at all, other than destroy people's lives. It baffles me that people continue to advocate for them to this day.
Here's another important thing to consider. Texas and Florida are both responsible for roughly 35% of the daily COVID cases reported, and are also the states with the most laid-back laws on COVID guidelines and restrictions.
Alright, so a couple things to note here. First of all, we know for a fact that the Florida data is inaccurate. The CDC has actually gone on record saying that they fudged Florida data because of a political bias against Ron DeSantis. But even assuming that all this data is 100% accurate as presented, there are still problems with the conclusions that Misha tries to draw from it. For example, we do know that Florida did experience a spike in cases during the summer months, but this doesn't really have anything to do with them having lax rules and restrictions on COVID. This is just because during summer people do more traveling and Florida just so happens to be a popular vacation destination. Of course, Florida is going to experience a spike in cases if there's more people traveling there. Other states also experienced a similar spike in cases due to travel during the summer months. It's also important to point out that there are other states that similarly have lax restrictions on COVID that didn't experience such a spike, and that states with very severe COVID restrictions also experienced spikes. You see, it's simply not accurate to just look at data from only 2 states and from that conclude that not implementing any COVID restrictions causes more cases.
With Florida making it illegal to require vaccinations for businesses and events, and I believe Texas doing the same.
So I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way right now. I don't agree with that. I'm a libertarian. I believe in private property rights. I think it's on business owners to set their own vaccination policy, even if I personally disagree with businesses requiring vaccines.
So if we minus the roughly 31,000 from the total, I'm rounding, but if you'd like to do it yourself, the numbers are there, but what we end up with is 54,000 cases spread out across 48 states. This is still a lot, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot less than the 85,000 we started with.
So in a country with a population of over 300 million, there's only 85,000 new cases a day. And that's just confirmed cases, that's not even deaths or hospitalizations. Shouldn't that kind of signal to you that this whole thing is being blown at least a little bit out of proportion?
It's also essential to mention that the case spikes are more common in red states, whom have more anti-vax and anti-mask people residing there. So more than likely the blue states are going to be a bit safer.
Yeah, this is straight up wrong. As in, it can be debunked with a quick Google search. Red states tend to have comparable case numbers to equally populated blue states. As a matter of fact, the 3 states that have been slammed the worst during the pandemic, California, Michigan, and New York, are all Democrat-controlled states, with a lot of Republican-controlled states only spiking recently. So yeah, the narrative he's trying to push here is a crock of shit.
But still be cautious nonetheless. One more note, while this spike is affecting primarily non-vaccinated people, those vaccinated can still catch it. That being said, the spread is a lot less, you're less likely to catch it, and your symptoms will be a lot less severe. Keep this in mind when attending events and such, even if you're vaccinated. Now that we've discussed why cons can't reasonably cancel and how COVID is looking in the US, let's talk about the pros and cons of conventions happening. I'll start with the pros. One major pro is just being able to see everyone again. COVID's kept us behind closed doors and away from friends for so long, and finally being able to travel and go out and about to see our friends again has truly been a blessing. Now, I've only really seen my local friends, but the furry community having such a heavy basis online, we oftentimes make friends and bonds that are more commonly long distance. So lockdowns cause those friends to be far apart for a long period of time. I can only imagine the amazing feeling of seeing your long distance friend for the first time in almost a year and a half, finally being able to hug them, see them, and be closer than just through a screen or on social media.
I feel at this point it's worth pointing out another major downside of lockdowns, and that is the effect that prolonged social isolation has on the brain. Being forced to isolate inside for long periods of time is definitely not good for a person. There have been massive spikes in depression and anxiety and even suicide because of lockdowns. Kids as young as 10 have committed suicide, and that's not to mention obesity, alcoholism, drug abuse, spousal violence, and a whole host of other things that are on the rise because of lockdowns. I think it's pretty safe to say that the COVID hysteria has caused way more harm than COVID itself.
Another point to be made is the vaccination status of the community as a whole. Furries have a much higher rate of being vaccinated due to various reasons, and thus more people as a whole are going to be vaccinated at conventions.
So notice that the only data that he presents is a poll. The thing about polls is that they tend to be a notoriously inaccurate way of gathering data. There's numerous assumptions that they operate on, such as the truthfulness of the respondents, or that the sample group is accurately representative of the whole. Misha here basically took a poll of his own fan base and from that extrapolated that to the entire furry fandom. The problem with that is that his specific fan base might not necessarily be an accurate representation of the entire furry fandom. I'm sure if I did a similar poll of my fan base, you would see different results. Now, of course, I definitely believe that most furries are vaccinated. The furry fandom is very left-leaning for reasons that are once again beyond the scope of this particular video. So yeah, I wouldn't doubt for a second that most furries have the COVID vaccine. I'm just criticizing his epistemic process here.
On top of that, some conventions are even requiring vaccinations as a mandatory thing for attending the con.
So let me briefly explain to you why it is that furry conventions are doing this, because it's not about health. There's no data anywhere to suggest that vaccines prevent transmission or that unvaccinated people put vaccinated people at risk. This is quite simply a business decision. Let me explain it this way. The convention is going to lose attendees whether they decide to require vaccines or not. So it's a matter of which decision is going to cost them less attendees. Now, since the furry fandom is left-leaning, like I've discussed previously, the number of people who are scared of COVID and therefore won't attend a con unless vaccines are mandatory is greater than the number of people who don't want to take the vaccine. Therefore, requiring vaccines is a prudent business decision for these conventions. Whether or not requiring vaccines does actually make the convention safer.
Though most cons have settled with either requiring vaccination proof or a negative COVID test shortly before the convention.
This I consider to be at least somewhat reasonable, because now you have an option. If you don't want to take the vaccine or can't for whatever reason, you can just take a test and still participate in the convention. One potential downside to this, however, is that a lot of conventions aren't accepting the rapid antigen test you can get at the pharmacy for cheap. They want the full-on PCR test, which means you have to actually schedule an appointment with a laboratory, and if your insurance doesn't cover it, that can be expensive.
These are both great requirements for cons.
This is something I firmly disagree with. I don't think it's fair to exclude people from events because of their personal health decisions. I've mentioned this in previous videos, but one of the things that I'm finding very concerning about this rush to mandate the vaccine is that it's going to start setting the precedent that people are going to start making medical decisions as a result of external pressure, as opposed to whether or not it's good for them. Now look, I am pro-vaccine, I've taken the vaccine, there's tons of data that shows that it's very safe and effective, but some people out there simply don't want to take it. And there are perfectly valid reasons why someone might not want to take the vaccine. Some people might have natural immunity from having already caught COVID, so for them the vaccine is just an unnecessary additional risk. Some people might have a valid medical reason why they can't take it, such as they're allergic to one of the ingredients, or they're prone to blood clots. I mean, is it really fair to cut these people off from the community just because they happen to be allergic to one of the ingredients? What if a convention had a policy that said black people aren't allowed to come, or Asians aren't allowed to come, or gays or lesbians aren't allowed to come? I don't see how that's any different from saying people who are allergic to the vaccine aren't allowed to come.
And have undeniably helped with curbing the spread at those conventions.
This is an easy conclusion to draw when every single convention is requiring vaccines. But in order to verify whether or not this is the case, we need a control group. That is, a convention that's not requiring vaccines, to give us a backdrop of comparison. Now, fortunately, we do have such a control group. Megaplex in Florida did not require the vaccine, and it had very high attendance rates. So you would probably expect people to come away from this convention with tons of positive cases, tons of hospitalizations, tons of symptoms. Well, at this convention where thousands of people were in attendance, only 5 people came away with positive tests. Not even any sort of severe symptoms, just positive tests. And we see similar results when looking at other events that don't require vaccines. So by looking at this data holistically, we can kind of see that requiring vaccines at conventions doesn't really add much in terms of safety.
Last but not least, masks. Masks have been an important element to helping fight COVID since the very beginning.
People on the left make this claim all the time, but there's basically no data to back it up. If masks were effective at curbing the spread of COVID, you expect to see a change in case numbers once a mask mandate is introduced. But when you look at the data, you don't really see that. Some places even experienced an increase in cases after implementing a mask mandate. At best, masks have a minimal effect on the rate of COVID transmission.
And have been a staple in our lives for almost 2 years now.
Yeah, people have been wearing masks for the past 2 years and COVID is still spiking. Shouldn't that kinda give you a hint?
Even before COVID, we've seen masks worn out in public places such as Japan when an individual is sick, and that's because they work in helping to not spread germs.
So yes, it's true that a lot of Asian cultures such as China and Japan have what's known as a mask culture, where it's considered perfectly normal for someone to wear a mask out in public when they're sick. Now, one of the things that these masks do is act as a warning signal. If you see someone with a mask that says, "Hey, I'm sick, you should keep your distance from me." When you force everybody to wear masks, whether or not they're sick, they kind of lose their effectiveness as that warning signal.
All of the future conventions I've seen have been requiring face coverings of some sort.
Yeah, and that's extremely idiotic considering that these same conventions are also requiring vaccines. I mean, if you're requiring vaccines, then everyone there's going to be protected, so what's the point of requiring masks too? You guys remember back when the CDC said you could take your mask off once you're vaccinated? Yeah, I remember that too.
And no, your suit head does not count.
Wow! You're an idiot!
What? Well, why not? Are you telling me that a small piece of fabric can stop COVID, but several inches of foam and glue can't? What are people supposed to do? Wear a mask under the fursuit head? Like that wouldn't unnecessarily put people at risk from heat exhaustion? And how would you even enforce that anyways? Like, what are you gonna do? Have convention staff go around inspecting underneath people's heads? I'm sorry, but that's just idiotic.
So, all in all, safety precautions are being taken and enforced by the conventions, but keep in mind they're not 100% safe.
A lot of these so-called precautions really don't do anything. It's basically security theater. It's there to make people feel safer. Kind of like those long TSA lines at the airport. There's no data or statistics that show that these security lines do anything to reduce the risk of a terrorist attack, but going through it makes you feel safer and therefore you're more likely to fly.
Some people seem to think that getting vaccinated is the end of COVID, that once you yourself are vaccinated, you'll never catch COVID again. This is simply not the case. You're less likely to catch it, but you're not invincible by any stretch of the words.
Well, I mean, yes, the vaccines aren't 100% perfect. There's still a risk of catching COVID even if you're vaccinated. But once you're vaccinated, that risk basically becomes so low that for all intents and purposes, you can just go back to your normal life. I mean, this entire pandemic, the vaccines have been sold to us as the ticket back to normal life, which is why it's 100% perfectly understandable why people are getting pissed off when they're being told they still have to wear a mask and do all these precautions even after being vaccinated.
Speaking of vaccination rates, yes, more furries overall are vaccinated, but the US as a whole is only around 50% vaccinated.
Maybe that was the case when Misha recorded this video, but as of right now, 3/4 of the country has at least one dose and 2/3 are fully vaccinated. And this data doesn't even include people who have natural immunity from having caught COVID before.
Now, why is the general populace relevant? I mean, it's just a furcon, right? We'll only see furries. Well, oftentimes furry conventions take place in hotels, and hotels will have other guests that aren't furries. Not to mention the amount of people you can and will see if you travel to another state to attend a con.
This is another reason I feel that vaccine requirements at conventions are kind of pointless. pointless. Because most conventions take place in public spaces, you're going to come in contact with people who may or may not be vaccinated anyways, which kind of defeats the purpose. As a matter of fact, vaccine requirements at conventions could actually potentially backfire and cause more spread, because people who want to attend the convention but don't want to take the vaccine will just congregate in areas outside the convention space, like in the public lobby and the hotel rooms, and other areas of the hotel you don't need a con badge to access. More unvaccinated people congregating in smaller spaces is just going to create more spread. You're better off just letting unvaccinated and vaccinated people mingle together.
So, what are my thoughts on the matter? Well, unfortunately, as I've stated, cons are kinda in a catch-22. They can't exactly cancel without being out a lot of money, so that's not a viable option. So with cons having no choice but to honor the contracts and happen, they are actively doing their best to keep the events as safe as possible, and from what I've seen, they've been doing an awesome job. Seemingly very little people have gotten COVID from attending events. Now it's possible and definitely a factor for some people that they did catch COVID but didn't post about it, but as a whole, the results seem to be most people testing negative.
So once again, he's basically crediting these authoritarian measures that conventions are implementing to low COVID numbers, even though there's no data anywhere to suggest that these measures are actually keeping people safe and that other conventions that aren't implementing these measures have similarly low COVID numbers.
If you're unvaccinated for any reason, it's likely in your best interest to not attend cons currently. COVID is still very active and is currently spiking, and without the vaccine you aren't protected from COVID. Sure, you can wear a mask, but that more so protects them from you more than you from them.
This is kind of an oversimplification. You see, there are actually different types of masks that offer different types of protection. Those blue fold-out surgical masks that doctors wear, those are primarily intended to protect people other than the wearer. The medical-grade N95 mask does actually protect the wearer. If you're someone who's immunocompromised or specifically vulnerable to COVID, getting your hands on an N95 might not be a bad idea.
So wearing a mask is great for everyone else's safety, but you're still very much at risk.
So the vaccine only prevents symptoms, not transmission? Well, in that case, then requiring vaccines at conventions is now completely pointless, because that means unvaccinated people are just as much at risk of spreading it as vaccinated people.
I personally think we're at a point where cons can happen safely, but we can't pretend like COVID is over. COVID is very much alive, and the only way we can continue to host meetups and cons is to take the fact very seriously, and be as safe as possible.
While you're at it, why not require flu vaccines too? I mean, people who aren't vaccinated against the flu are putting others at risk of catching the flu, and the flu is just as dangerous as COVID. The same goes for mumps, measles, chickenpox, polio, rubella. It's always been understood that going to a convention comes with the risk of catching an illness. I don't understand why COVID in particular is being put on some kind of a pedestal.
Require vaccinations, require masks, and be sure to heavily enforce these rules and regulations.
So basically, be a moral busybody and police other people's personal health decisions. I can't think of anything that just sucks the fun out of a convention more than bullshit like this. I refuse to go to any convention that requires masks. I hate those bands digging into my ears and the bottom half of my face getting all hot and sweaty. It's already bad enough I have to put up with that shit for 8 hours a day at the office I work at. I don't want to have to deal with that shit when I'm going to a convention where I just want to have fun and relax. Another major downside to requiring masks at conventions is that it can interfere with the creativity of cosplayers. If your costume involves any sort of makeup, then being forced to cover that with a mask big time interferes with that. I'm reminded of an incident that happened at a video game convention in Florida back in 2015. A Cammy cosplayer was forced to wear a pair of leggings over her leotard because someone complained and got offended. If you're the kind of person who needs to be a moral busybody and dictate the entirety of the experience for other convention attendees, then just keep your ass at home.
And quite simply, if you're uncomfortable with attending cons, then don't. Stay home and wait until you feel safe to attend. I'm still not quite comfortable with attending cons, so I'm waiting until later this year to see how the cases will look before I decide to get my Anthro Northwest ticket.
Well, Misha, if you'd rather wait a little bit before going back to conventions, if that would make you feel more comfortable, then that's your right. Go right ahead and do that. I just don't understand why we can't just treat people like adults and let them make these decisions for themselves. If people would feel more comfortable taking certain precautions like wearing a mask or taking the vaccine, I'm not against that at all. I actually think that getting the COVID vaccine before going to any large events is actually a pretty smart idea. I just don't understand why we can't just let people make that decision for themselves, though. There isn't any sort of data out there to suggest that forcing these precautions onto people protects anyone. All it really does is unnecessarily exclude people from the event and take the fun out of it. Now, I'm going to conclude this video with some words of encouragement to anyone out there in the furry fandom or in geek culture at large who's getting pretty sick of these vaccine and mask requirements at conventions. First of all, know that you're not alone. You might feel like you're alone, because it seems like a majority of furries are supporting this nonsense, But most of the support for this kind of stuff is coming from the SJW Twitter mob, which is only a tiny fraction of the fandom. A growing number of furries are actually against these requirements. They just don't want to say anything because of the backlash they'll face from the Twitter mob. The SJW Twitter furries just so happen to be the most vocal, and that's why they may seem like the majority. And it seems like that trend might be changing too. There were people on Twitter asking TFF not to require masks, which restored some hope for me. Also, if you put in some research, it's not difficult to find smaller local conventions and events that aren't requiring vaccines. Fancons.com is an excellent website to do such research. I actually found several local conventions that didn't require masks or vaccines, and I had a great time. And keep in mind that all of this is ultimately temporary. Yes, the Twitter SJW mob is going to try and drag this out as much as possible, but just remember that they can only do that for so long, especially now that the whole COVID narrative is starting to unravel. The CDC has been forced to backtrack some of their claims about masks. While things might seem bleak, just know that there is reason for hope. Until next time, this has been Philosophosa making stupidity play dead. Take care.